bird ended the age of monsters. Somewhere in Patagonia, roughly 45 million years ago, a creature the height of a professional basketball player and the weight of a large bear stood at the edge of a floodplain. And it was a bird, not a hawk, not an eagle, but something built like a feathered siege engine, with a skull longer than a human forearm and a beak that ended in a downward hook of solid bone. This is not a creature from the age of dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were already gone. This animal filled the silence they left behind, and it did so completely. A predator so precisely engineered for its world that for tens of millions of years, across 2 continents, nothing on the ground could stop it. The question that haunts every fossil of this lineage is deceptively simple. Our own ancestors were alive on the same planet, at the same time, moving through the same undergrowth. How did anything small and soft-bodied survive in a world that belonged entirely to this? Welcome to Fathomless. The skull alone tells you something has gone wrong with our assumption of what a bird is. This beak is not a foraging instrument or a display structure. It is a weapon. Deep from top to bottom, narrow side to side, ending in a hook of dense bone that curves with the clean geometry of a pickaxe. The skull behind it is proportionally vast, the bone reinforced at exactly the angles that matter when force is delivered downward at high speed. It is longer than a human forearm. In a living bird, that is almost incomprehensible, but the fossil record is unambiguous. This architecture evolved independently across multiple species within the forest-racid lineage, refined over millions of years. What you are looking at is not an accident of scale. It is the end product of an evolutionary pressure that selected again and again for the ability to strike with precision and devastating force. A pressure that shaped every bone in this animal's body from the beak to the toe. And yet the small thing survived. That is the paradox that makes this story worth telling. Under the feet of one of the most effectively designed predators in vertebrate history, something the size of a rabbit, tawny-furred, wide-eyed, built entirely for concealment and flight, was not only alive, but in the process of becoming, over the next 45 million years, the dominant lineage on the planet. The fossil record does not explain this with a single dramatic reversal. There is no moment where the small thing fought back and won. The answer is stranger and slower and more structural than that. And it begins not with the predator's weakness, but with the shape the world it inherited and the very specific conditions that made it so completely, so temporarily supreme. To understand the terror birds, you have to feel the shape of the world they inherited. The mass extinction 66 million years ago did not hand power to the mammals, not immediately, not cleanly. The first few million years of the Paleogene were a scramble, and the creatures that moved fastest into the ecological vacuum left by the non-avian dinosaurs were not the small furry things hiding in burrows. They were birds. The forests of the early Eocene were warm, dense, and structurally different from anything alive today. No grasses, no open savannas, an atmosphere still rich with the carbon of a warming world. Into that forest vacuum, with its abundance of plant material and its absence of any established large terrestrial predator, bird lineages began doing something their ancestors had not, growing large, losing flight, and stepping down onto the ground with intent. 2 separate lineages, independently grew enormous during this period on opposite sides of what was already becoming an insurmountable oceanic barrier. Gastornis, stocky, massive-beaked, nearly 2 meters tall, appeared in the forests of what is now Europe and North America. On the other side of the widening Atlantic, in the warm lowlands of South America, a different lineage was beginning its own ascent. The Forus racids, the family that would later earn the name terror birds. Both groups reached extraordinary size through parallel evolutionary pressures. But their worlds were fundamentally different. Different forests, different prey, different ecological competitors. And those differences inscribed themselves into every bone of each animal's body. The separation matters enormously because the story of why one line eventually disappeared while the other persisted for tens of millions of years longer begins right here in the geography of the early Eocene, and it hinges on a piece of evidence that most people assume settles the whole question before it is even fully asked. And the piece of evidence in question begins with Gastornis, because Gastornis was, for most of the 20th century, assumed to be the definitive proof that large carnivorous birds dominated the post-dinosaur world. Its bones are remarkable, legs thick enough that early paleontologists assigned fragments to entirely different animals before the creature was properly reconstructed, and a skull built with a robustness that initially had no obvious explanation other than predation. An animal that size, with a beak that formidable, had to be killing large prey. The assumption felt self-evident. But the fossil record has a way of undermining self-evident assumptions, and what happened when researchers examined the chemical signatures preserved inside Gastornis bone and enamel changed the interpretation of this animal entirely, and sharpened the contrast between it and the South American lineage in ways nobody initially expected. Isotope analysis of Gastornis enamel and bone has produced a result that still surprises people encountering the story for the first time. The chemical signatures preserved in the fossil matrix, the ratios of stable isotopes of carbon and calcium locked into the mineral structure of the bone itself, are more consistent with a diet dominated by plant material than with the flesh-heavy diet of a pursuit predator. Hard seeds, fibrous vegetation, possibly tubers and tough roots. The isotope profiles align more closely with large herbivores than with carnivores. If that reading holds, and it remains the leading interpretation, though not every researcher considers the question entirely closed, then Gastornis was not a killer at the apex of the food chain. It was something more like an armored herbivore, enormous, undoubtedly capable of defending itself with devastating force, but not a hunter. That distinction matters enormously, because the Forus racids of South America were something else entirely, and the anatomy that set them apart is written not in their skulls, but in their feet. The Forus racid foot is the first real clue to how these animals actually functioned as predators. Unlike the broad spreading toes of raptors designed to seize and hold struggling prey, Forus acid feet were narrow, forward-oriented, and structured around a single mechanical priority: acceleration across open ground. Bone geometry and limb proportion studies place their estimated top speed in a range broadly comparable to a modern ostrich, with some models suggesting bursts possibly exceeding 45 kilometers per hour, though precise figures vary by specimen and methodology. The architecture is unambiguous in its purpose. This is not an ambush animal built for explosive concealment. It is a pursuit predator, designed to close distance across open floodplains and scrubland to run down prey that simply could not match it. The feet alone tell you the hunting strategy, but the most unexpected anatomical detail is not in the feet at all. The vestigial wings of forest wrasses are, in most reconstructions, reduced to small feathered stubs, evolutionary remnants of the flight apparatus their ancestors once possessed. They are too small to assist with balance, too reduced for any aerodynamic function. But in certain well-preserved specimens, the leading edge of that stub preserves a hooked claw at the wrist joint. The leading hypothesis among researchers who have examined these specimens is that this remnant claw was not a vestige being passively shed by evolution, but a retained functional structure, a close-range grappling tool deployed in the final seconds of a hunt after the chase had already been decided, to help pin or control prey before the decisive blow. A pursuit predator that could run down its target, hook it at close range, and then, only then, bring the skull into play. What happened in that final moment mechanically is where the skull's architecture stops being simply impressive and starts being genuinely strange. The forest wrassid skull is not simply large. It is large in a specific engineered way. The beak is deep and laterally compressed, narrow side to side, tall top to bottom, and that geometry has mechanical consequences. A structure shaped this way resists bending along the vertical axis far more effectively than it resists twisting. Biomechanical analyses of skull stress distribution suggest this architecture is poorly suited to the sustained side-wrenching struggle of gripping and shaking large, actively resisting prey, the killing strategy of a crocodile or a large canid. Instead, the skull appears optimized for a single, precisely delivered, high-force strike downward, an axe blow. Not a bite and hold, but a point-load impact concentrated through the beak's tip at maximum force. The engineering analogy is not dramatic license. It is the literal conclusion of stress distribution modeling applied to the fossil geometry, and it changes everything about how we reconstruct the hunt. The working hypothesis, drawn from the skull's biomechanics, reconstructs a hunting sequence that is coldly methodical, a sustained chase across open ground, the forest wrassid's narrow speed-built feet eating up distance, its body leaning forward at the angle of a sprinting theropod, the vestigial wrist claw deployed at close range to pin or redirect, and then the skull brought down with precision, a single high-force vertical strike, the beak's geometry concentrating force into a point, delivered to the target with the leverage of a 3-meter-tall animal's full body weight. Not wrestling, not shaking. Execution. The animals on the receiving end of this strategy were, for tens of millions of years, the mammals of Paleogene and Neogene South America, and they were not the large, powerful creatures we might picture when we imagine prey worthy of such a predator. They were native ungulates, rodents, and marsupials shaped by a continent that had been an island. There were no lions here, no hyenas, nothing that had ever needed to evolve a response to this. And so for millions of years, nothing evolved to effectively contest what the forest wrassids had claimed. The small mammals below that beak were not staging a resistance. They were surviving in margins, nocturnal niches, dense cover, the brief windows between a predator's attention and its next strike. The paradox holds: an apex predator of extraordinary design, ruling a continent, surrounded by the ancestors of the animals that would eventually outlast it. The question is not how the terror birds were eventually defeated. It is why that process took so long, and what finally triggered it. And the answer begins not with another predator, but with the geography of an island that was, for tens of millions of years, the perfect closed system for a lineage built to dominate exactly the world it had. That system held until it didn't. South America spent most of the Paleogene and Neogene as a biological island, drifting without a land connection to North America. The mammals that shared the continent with the forest wrasses were the products of that isolation. Lineages that had never encountered a large, fast terrestrial predator capable of delivering a killing blow from above, and had therefore never evolved the behavioral or physical adaptations to counter one. The Sparassodonts, the native South American predatory mammals, occupied their own niches and appear to have partitioned the ecosystem with the terror birds, rather than competing directly at the apex of the food chain. The system was in equilibrium. Everything that lived there had evolved within it, shaped by pressures that excluded the kind of arms race that was happening simultaneously on other continents. That isolation was not a weakness. For millions of years, it was the condition that made everything work. The fossil assemblages that document this closed system dominance stretch across Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Colombia, and they record a lineage persisting across roughly 60 million years, from the Eocene into the Pleistocene. That duration dwarfs the entire existence of our own genus by more than an order of magnitude, and during that time, the lineage diversified across a range of body sizes, some species relatively small and fast, specialists in different prey and terrain, others among the largest, approaching or possibly exceeding 3 meters in height. The largest known genus, Kelenken, is represented by a skull fragment estimated at around 70 centimeters in length, one of the largest bird skulls in the fossil record. The diversity alone tells you this was not a lineage clinging to survival. It was thriving, elaborating, filling space. But the fossil record eventually goes quiet, and the reason begins with something that was not alive and could not be hunted or outrun, a corridor of land that had not existed for tens of millions of years. The first sign of that change was not biological. It was geological. Around 3 million years ago, the Isthmus of Panama rose from the sea, a process measured in millions of years of tectonic compression, but arriving, in ecological terms, with the suddenness of a door swinging open. Two continents that had been separated since the early Paleogene were now physically connected, and the consequences for the living world on both sides would be staggering. South America's closed system, the isolation that had let the forest wrasses reign without meaningful competition for 60 million years, was about to end. The barrier that had been their invisible protector, the ocean that had kept the northern predators out, was gone. And what crossed that corridor in the millions of years that followed is what makes the final chapter of the terror bird story so much more complicated and so much more honest than the simple story of conquest that most accounts tell. When the land bridge finally closed the gap, the animals that crossed it were not a trickle. They were a flood constrained only by time. Gomphotheres, horses, tapirs, and deer moved south into a continent whose grasslands and river systems had never been grazed by anything shaped quite like them. Close behind came the predators that had co-evolved alongside those prey animals through millions of years of relentless selection. Saber-toothed cats, large canids, bear-like animals whose lineages had been sharpened by an arms race the forest racids had simply never experienced. For the first time in 60 million years, South America's closed system cracked open, and the forest racids, for so long the unchallenged architects of every food chain they inhabited, now shared their continent with competitors who had spent tens of millions of years learning to bring down exactly the kind of large mobile prey the terror birds had built their dynasty upon. The door had swung open, and something was already walking through it. South American animals did not simply receive the newcomers, they pushed back. Ground sloths and glyptodonts moved north across the same corridor, colonizing habitats from Central America up into what is now the southern United States. And notably, the forest racids themselves made the crossing. Fossil evidence places Titanus walleri in what is now Florida and Texas, a terror bird on North American soil, sharing a landscape already occupied by North American megafauna. For a moment in geological time, the terror birds were on two continents again. It should have marked an expansion of their range, a new chapter. Instead, the fossil record grows thin, then silent. Within a geologically brief interval after the interchange, the forest racids vanish from South America's fossil assemblages. For decades, the reading was simple. The northern predators outcompeted them. They were replaced. They lost. But when researchers looked at the timing of that disappearance more carefully, the simple story stopped being simple, and the evidence pointed somewhere no one had initially thought to look. The fossil record is not a continuous broadcast. It is a series of silences interrupted by preservation. But the silence that follows the forest racids is specific enough to be meaningful. Stratigraphic data from South American fossil beds shows the largest forest racid species thinning out across the late Miocene and into the Pliocene, a window of time that precedes the full establishment of northern placental predators in the southern continent. The invaders had not yet arrived in forests when the terror birds were already declining. That mismatch in timing is the crack in the conquest narrative. It forces a harder question. If it was not the new predators that broke them, what did? And that question begins to pull the climate record into the center of the story, not as backdrop, but as cause. The grasslands the forest racids had built their dominance upon were themselves beginning to change. Sediment cores and fossil pollen records from the late Miocene and Pliocene tell a consistent story. South America was cooling and drying. The open grassland and floodplain habitats that forest racids had exploited for pursuit hunting, the long sight lines, the firm, open ground that amplified their speed advantage, were contracting. In their place came denser scrubland and fragmented woodland, terrain that fundamentally degraded the effectiveness of an animal built to run down prey in the open. At the same time, the native South American ungulates and other prey species the terror birds had co-evolved with were themselves restructuring under the same climate pressures. The ecological contract that had sustained the forest racids for tens of millions of years, open ground, specific prey, no serious competition, was being renegotiated simultaneously on every term. What the evidence points toward is not a single killing blow, but a compound vulnerability, multiple pressures converging at once, each one manageable in isolation, together, forming something that the lineage's deep specialization had left it unable to absorb. And that unresolved combination, climate, habitat, prey, competition, is precisely what makes the final detail so striking. The terror birds did not go out uniformly. The last forest racids are found not in the deep interior of South America, where the lineage had been most diverse and most dominant, but at the geographic and ecological margins, in the places where the precise conditions they depended on persisted longest. Titanus, the species that crossed the land bridge north, survived into the Pleistocene in what is now North America, sharing its landscape with mammoths, giant ground sloths, and eventually with early humans approaching the continent along its edges. The exact timing of Titanus's final disappearance remains debated. Claims of survival into the very latest Pleistocene have not yet been confirmed by specimens that are directly radiometrically dated. But the survival itself reveals something essential. The terror birds were not inherently fragile. They were not outclassed by any single rival. Titanus persisted in North America for a geologically meaningful interval precisely because the configuration of open terrain, available prey, and manageable competition held together long enough to sustain it. The lineage failed not from weakness, but from precision. When the grasslands finally contracted, when the prey base shifted and the climate reorganized the landscape one last time, the specialization that had made the forest racids unbeatable for 60 million years became the very thing that could not bend. What those two tracks, pressed into the same mud, actually record is not a confrontation. It is a divergence. The small omnivorous ancestors running through the undergrowth beneath the terror birds were not built to win against a forest racid on any terms the forest racid understood. They were not faster. They were not stronger. They were not better armed. What they were was behaviorally flexible, capable of eating seeds, insects, roots, small vertebrates, almost anything the landscape offered, capable of sheltering in almost any kind of cover, capable of reorganizing their movements and their social patterns faster than any slow geological change could track. The forest racids were the perfect instrument of a specific world. The small mammals were imperfect instruments of almost any world. And that asymmetry, precision versus plasticity, is the engine behind every large-scale transition in the history of life. The terror birds were not defeated. Their world simply stopped being built for them, and the small things kept moving through whatever world came next. So, the answer to the question this video opened with, how did anything small and soft survive a planet ruled by a bird that could execute its prey with a single downward blow, is not a story of combat or cunning or some biological advantage the mammals eventually developed. The forest racids were among the most durable large predators in vertebrate history by any honest measure. 60 million years, 2 continents, dozens of species across one of the longest sustained dynasties the fossil record documents. They did not lose because something better came along and defeated them in the terms they understood. They lost because the world they were built for stopped existing. The open ground dried up, the prey restructured, the climate turned, and the competitors arrived all at once. And their extraordinary precision gave them no alternative architecture to fall back on. The mammals that outlasted them, including the lineage that would eventually produce every human being who has ever asked this question, survived not because they were stronger or swifter or better equipped for any single fight. They survived because they could eat almost anything, shelter almost anywhere, and find a way to remain possible when everything around them stopped being so. Back on that Patagonian floodplain, the small things moving through the undergrowth beneath the terror bird's feet were not hiding from the future. They were quietly, unremarkably becoming it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Here we restore extinct animals using AI.